For the first time, we're going to check out the grounds of a first-class cricket league. The County Championship is one of the oldest sports leagues in the world and has some of the oldest stadiums in the world. So here are the County Championship grounds. County Ground, Essex. This quaint old ground has been one of the most difficult for away teams to visit in the last few years. That's certainly not to do with any sort of intimidating atmosphere. This is the smallest Division 1 ground. However, that doesn't really matter in first-class cricket. You don't ever see sell-out crowds. The pitch is usually more important than any sort of atmosphere when it comes to home ground advantage. Anyway, although the ground is simple, it does have its quirks. This double-stacked stand in particular. It's not something you see too often. Rose Bowl, Hampshire. It's a bowl in name and nature, which is something worth pointing out because unlike in Australia and India, where multi-tiered bowls are the standard, this is the only cricket ground in England that you could actually call a bowl. You may have noticed the stadium's large open concourses. Well, they're there in order to easily expand the stadium for international matches. As you can see, they put temporary stands up there. Other than that, there is actually a stand here named after the late great Shane Warne, who captained Hampshire for a long time. I'd imagine he's the only Australian with a stand named after him in a test cricket ground in England, but I could be wrong. The Spitfire Ground, Kent. Interestingly, it's only known as the Spitfire Ground because it's sponsored by a beer brand called Spitfire. But the team is also known as the Kent Spitfires. Perfect synergy. I'm glad they turned down the sponsorship offer from the Messerschmitt Brewery. The ground throughout most of its history was famous for a lime tree that sat within the playing area. Unfortunately, that died a few years back and was replaced with a new tree, which is no longer within the playing area. This is a rather charming old ground. Old Trafford, Lancashire. In case you were wondering, the other Old Trafford is just over there. They are both named after the area in which they are located. I think I prefer this Old Trafford, to be honest. Once more, there are large areas that are left empty during first-class cricket, but have temporary stands added during internationals. That empty concrete space is a bit of an eyesore, however, I think the rest of the stadium makes up for that. There are some unique modern buildings for functions and whatnot, but the highlight is still the old-fashioned pavilion, which is quite beautiful. Lords, Middlesex. This is the biggest, oldest and the most iconic cricket stadium in England, and probably in the world with regards to the latter two. The most famous part of the stadium is once more the stunning pavilion. This one is not as old as the ground itself, but is still over 130 years old. However, the best thing about Lords is that despite its age, they haven't shied away from adopting modern architecture. I mean, this media centre looks like something out of the Star Treks. Oh, and I can't talk about Lords without mentioning the sloping field. Even the pitch itself has a slight slope to it. County Ground, Northamptonshire. Oddly enough, this ground has a long footballing history. It was home to the still existing Northampton town for nearly 100 years. It has a very interesting array of different stands and pavilions. This stand in particular does look like something you might see at a football ground. I suppose they might have set up the football pitch along that side. There is, however, no mistaking that this old stand with its beautiful old school aesthetic was built for cricket. Trent Bridge, Nottinghamshire. This would have to be one of my favourite cricket grounds in the country, mostly due to the unique architecture, whether it be the old pavilion, or this much newer yet still classical looking stand on the other side. The ground does have some odd dimensions, most notably how it seems to have been cut off by this stand, leaving that area with a potentially very short boundary. So no surprises that the ground is typically higher scoring in white ball cricket, less so on a green top during the Ashes. County Ground, Somerset. Firstly, a few years back when the pitch was known for being very spin-friendly, this ground gained the nickname Ciderabad, which I just love. So that's what I'm going to call it. Let's put the title card back up. That's more like it. Hyderabad. It's certainly better than county ground. Anyway, the ground itself has some beautiful old stands and a pavilion, as well as a cathedral in the backdrop, which always makes for a pleasant sight. I'm just not such a fan of this section with the attached apartments, but so be it. The Oval, Surrey. This is a stadium of contrasts. The eastern end of the ground is antiquated and constructed mostly of brick, whereas the western side is basically as modern as it gets in English cricket. The big sweeping multi-tiered stand looks even more modern on the outside. I mentioned the footballing history of the Northamptonshire ground. Well, this was the site of the first ever international football match, where England drew with Scotland 1-1. It's also hosted Australian rules football, oddly enough. It is the right shape, I guess. Not all of the grounds have actually been oval. Edgbaston, Warwickshire. This ground was the site of the highest ever score in first class cricket. Brian Lara with his 501 not out playing for Warwickshire. The game ended in a draw, which is a surprise to no one. The stadium itself is known for its especially intimidating atmosphere, particularly in international cricket. That's mostly due to the steep multi-tiered seating that makes up the main stand. I mean, it's still cricket though. You're probably not going to get a glass bottle or a flare thrown at you, but still. People shouting at you saying you have a funny walk might rock your confidence. County Ground, Derbyshire. This is not the smallest ground in the league, capacity-wise, but it certainly looks it. It's the only ground where in some places beyond the grass field on the other side of the fence is just more grass. And not even an embankment where people can sit. I suppose a lot of the capacity is coming from this big temporary looking stand over here. It's certainly not the prettiest, but it does the job. Riverside Ground, Durham. Immediately you might notice something peculiar about this ground. The angular shape of the field. I believe Chesterless Street is the smallest town in the county championship. There are under 25,000 people here, and considering that, it's a pretty impressive venue. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this stadium is not within the stadium at all. Spectators are treated with a rather nice view of Durham Castle. Sophia Gardens, home of Glamorgan, who are the only Welsh county in the county championship. This is much newer than most or all of the grounds in county cricket, and so there's no classical looking pavilion or ornate facades. It just looks like a basic modern stadium. However, the setting itself is quite nice. It's situated amongst the gardens by the River Taff. And I do also appreciate the artwork there in the stands, befitting of the ground's botanical related name. County Ground, Gloucestershire. Similar to Hyderabad, the ground is dominated by some attached apartment buildings. But unlike Taunton, there isn't much in the way of quaint old stands to make up for that. So overall it's looking a little bland. One thing that is quite interesting about the ground's history is that the ground was initially purchased by W.G. Grace, who is perhaps England's most famous ever cricketer. If not, then at least the most famous Gloucestershire cricketer. If not, then certainly the most famous bearded Gloucestershire cricketer of the late 1800s. Well, that's quite the coincidence. Grace Road, Leicestershire. It's not named after W.G. Grace, in case you were wondering. It's named after the road it's on, which of course is named after someone who has nothing to do with cricket. This ground has a peculiar seating layout, the most unusual part of which is probably this small ad hoc looking section of seating that sits atop the roof. It actually looks like a nice place to watch a game from, but there are no shortages of that at this ground. Situated in the seaside town of Hove is the originally named County Ground, home of Sussex. The ground is located less than a kilometre from the beach, the closest of any grounds you'll see in this video. And in keeping with the relaxed vibe of a coastal town, there is a small grass embankment, with some wooden outdoor furniture, where spectators can kick back, relax, perhaps while eating some fish and chips, maybe even some shark and chips. Do you get shark at the fish and chip shop in England? It's very common in Australia. I mean, we call it flake for some reason. Anyway, next venue please. New Road, Worcestershire. In case you were wondering, it's called New Road because it's situated on New Road. This is another ground with a stunning cathedral in the backdrop. It's also situated right next to the River Severn, so it's certainly a tranquil setting. However, when that river bursts its banks, as it often does, the entire ground is known to flood. But when it is above the water, it's a lovely little ground. Headingley, Yorkshire, the most successful club in county cricket history, plays in what might be the most unusual ground in county cricket. Well, I am just referring to the fact that it is Siamese, or conjoined I should say. That is a rugby league ground next door in case you were wondering. The ground itself isn't actually that unusual. It has had a new pavilion built in recent years with an interesting geometric design, and overall there really isn't much in the way of antique oddities, like we've seen at other grounds, this small building being the exception. So there you have it. I usually pick a favourite stadium at the end of the video, and yeah, as you may have expected, it's got to be Lord's. So much history, so much character. It's the home of cricket. If you're new, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching, have a good one.